By the end of 2024, archaeologist Nick Card thought the Ness of Brodgar was finished, that there were no more discoveries to be found. But then, the radar scans revealed underground shapes that defied everything known about the site. What was this discovery, and why did it leave Nick and his team of archaeologists stunned? Let's find out. The excavation that was supposed to be over. When the Ness of Brodgar was finally backfilled in 2024, it marked the end of an era. For more than 20 years, archaeologists had returned to this windswept strip of land summer after summer, carefully peeling back layers of soil to reveal one of the most complex Neolithic sites ever found in Britain. Ending that work was not a decision taken lightly. It came not because the discoveries had dried up, but because there were simply too many of them. By that point, the team led by archaeologist Nick Card was sitting on an overwhelming volume of material: buildings, art, animal bone, pottery, architectural sequences, radiocarbon dates, and detailed records that still needed years of analysis. Leaving the site open indefinitely would have risked erosion, damage, and the slow loss of context that gives archaeology its meaning. Closing the trenches was, in Card's view, an act of responsibility rather than retreat. There was also something quietly emotional about it. Many of the structures uncovered at the Ness had been deliberately buried by their builders thousands of years ago, sealed with midden and stone as part of what appeared to be ritual closures. Backfilling them again felt, in a strange way, like completing a cycle rather than interrupting one. Yet even as the final layers went back in, there was an awareness that not everything had been answered. Only a fraction of the site had been excavated, and beneath the surface lay possibilities no one could yet test. What no one expected was that the most disruptive discovery of all would come after the digging stopped. With the Ness sealed and supposedly settled, archaeologists turned to new ways of looking at what remained hidden, and it was there, in the quiet aftermath of excavation, that the story took an unexpected turn. To understand why returning mattered at all, it helps to understand what archaeologists believed they had already uncovered. Ness of Brodgar, a site with buried mysteries. The Ness of Brodgar was always different, even before anyone cut a trench into it. Geographically, it occupies a position that feels almost too deliberate to be accidental. It lies between two lochs, Stennis and Here, on a narrow causeway of land, with the ring of Brodgar stone circled to one side and the standing stones of Stennis to the other. A short distance away sits Maisshawa, one of the most impressive chambered tombs in Europe. Long before excavation, this arrangement raised a quiet but persistent question: why here? From the surface, the Ness appeared as little more than a grassy rise, a broad hump in the landscape that resisted easy interpretation. Early theories ranged from a natural formation to the remains of later agricultural activity, yet its placement within the heart of Neolithic Orkney, a UNESCO World Heritage landscape, already dense with monuments, made it hard to ignore. This was not empty ground between famous sites. It was the space that connected them. That sense of connection mattered. Archaeologists began to suspect that the Ness was not peripheral, but central, perhaps even the missing piece that explained how the surrounding monuments related to one another. Expectations grew quickly, but so did uncertainty. The site refused to fit neatly into existing categories. It didn't look like a settlement in the traditional sense, yet it was far too complex to dismiss as purely ceremonial. From the beginning, the Ness seemed to strain the boundaries of what Neolithic sites were supposed to be. It invited big questions and resisted simple answers. That tension lingered for years, growing sharper as more was uncovered, and it became impossible to ignore once archaeologists stopped relying on educated guesses and began using technology to see beneath the surface itself. Nick Card and the first shock beneath the turf. The first real shock at the Ness of Brodgar did not come from excavation, but from instruments dragged quietly across the ground. In 2002, geophysicist John Gator carried out a survey of the area using magnetometry, a technique designed to detect buried features without disturbing the soil. What appeared in the data was so dense, so packed with anomalies, that even Gator initially doubted it. The results looked less like archaeology and more like natural geology. Nick Card, then working with the University of the Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute, took a closer look. Rather than dismissing the data, he made the decision to test it in the only way archaeology ultimately can, by opening small trenches. What emerged almost immediately overturned expectations. Beneath the turf lay substantial stone architecture, far more ambitious than anyone had predicted. Walls were thick, carefully built, and laid out with precision. This was not a marginal site or a scatter of structures. As excavation expanded in the mid-2000s, Card became increasingly central to the project. His approach was marked by a careful balance between curiosity and caution. Each new discovery raised bigger questions, but interpretations were never rushed. Instead, the site was allowed to reveal itself gradually, layer by layer. Over time, it became clear that the Ness was not just significant, but exceptional. Those early trenches opened a door onto a prehistoric world that seemed larger, more organized, and more symbolically charged than Neolithic Britain had previously allowed for. Yet they also set boundaries. Digging could only go so far, and each season exposed how much more remained untouched. The Ness was beginning to look like a complete story, but one written on pages archaeologists had not yet learned how to read. A discovery unlike anything ever seen before. As excavation seasons unfolded, it became clear that the Ness of Brodgar was not simply yielding information. It was overturning expectations. What began as a promising anomaly beneath the turf rapidly grew into one of the most complex prehistoric sites ever uncovered in Britain. Over time, archaeologists revealed more than 40 substantial stone buildings, many of them monumental in scale and precision. These were not domestic structures improvised for daily survival. The masonry was carefully dressed, the walls thick and deliberately engineered, and the layouts consistent enough to suggest shared planning principles rather than isolated efforts. One structure in particular forced a rethink of the entire site. A massive enclosing wall, in places approaching 6 meters in thickness, appeared to define the inner heart of the complex. Its sheer scale implied more than boundary making. It suggested control. Movement into and out of the core area was likely regulated, reinforcing the idea that the Ness functioned as a special, possibly restricted space within the wider Neolithic landscape. Even more revealing was the site's long, layered life. Buildings were not erected and abandoned. They were rebuilt, modified, and sometimes deliberately dismantled. Floors were resurfaced, walls were thickened, entrances were altered. In many cases, structures were ritually closed, filled with midden-rich and cattle bone, pottery, and worked stone. This material was not rubbish that had been casually discarded. It was carefully placed, sealing buildings in a way that suggested symbolic endings rather than practical necessity. Then there was the art. Carved stone slabs bearing chevrons, lozenges, and tightly controlled geometric motifs emerged in numbers unmatched anywhere else in Atlantic Europe. These were not decorative flourishes added at random. They formed a consistent visual language, repeated across buildings and generations, hinting at shared beliefs and identities maintained over centuries. Alongside this, the evidence for feasting was unmistakable. Vast quantities of cattle bone pointed to large communal gatherings, likely drawing people to the Ness from across Orkney and beyond. By this stage, archaeologists felt they were looking at something unusually complete. The Ness of Brodgar appeared culturally coherent, architecturally consistent, and firmly anchored in the Neolithic world. It seemed to have a beginning, a long and elaborate middle, and a deliberate end. However, this was not even 10% of what the entire site hid beneath itself, and that is exactly why what appeared later would prove so deeply unsettling. The limits of excavation and the hunger to uncover more. By the time the Ness of Brodgar was sealed in 2024, archaeologists had uncovered an extraordinary amount, but they were also acutely aware of how much remained untouched. Less than 10% of the site had been excavated, and that was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice shaped by experience, preservation ethics, and hard-earned caution. Every trench opened brought new information, but it also brought exposure. Stones that had survived millennia beneath the soil began to weather almost immediately once uncovered, vulnerable to wind, rain, and salt carried in from the sea. As the seasons passed, the team faced a growing dilemma. Continuing to dig would undoubtedly reveal more, but it would also accelerate the slow erosion of the very evidence they were trying to protect. At the same time, the volume of data already recovered had outpaced the ability to fully analyze it. Architecture needed phasing, artifacts needed cataloging, and radiocarbon dates required careful interpretation. Excavation, once the engine of discovery, was becoming a bottleneck. Nick Card was increasingly vocal about restraint. For him, archaeology was not about uncovering everything at once, but about making decisions that future researchers would not regret. Techniques evolve, tools improve, and questions change. Preserving parts of the Ness untouched meant preserving possibilities. It also meant accepting uncertainty. There were areas beyond the trenches that no one had seen, shapes hinted at in earlier geophysical surveys, but never fully understood. That gap between what was known and what remained hidden became impossible to ignore. The Ness had been framed as a coherent Neolithic complex, but coherence can sometimes mask complexity. The unexcavated areas were no longer just blank spaces on a plan. They were potential chapters in the story, waiting for a different kind of approach. In 2025, archaeologists decided to ask what lay beyond the trenches without lifting a single stone. The A-Strange anomaly, another shocking discovery. When the ground-penetrating radar data began coming in, no one on the team was expecting a rupture in the story they thought they already knew. The Ness of Brodgar had been excavated for over 20 years. Its architectural logic felt familiar. Even surprises tended to fit within a recognizable pattern. This did not. What appeared beneath the turf was not a vague blur or a cluster of noise that could be dismissed as natural geology. It was sharply defined, cleanly edged, and unmistakably deliberate. At a site dominated by thick walls, complex layouts, and gradual rebuilding, this feature stood apart. Its form had a geometry that felt almost uncomfortable in its precision. It did not echo the language of the surrounding structures. It contradicted it. Nick Card would later describe it as totally at odds with the Ness, and that phrase carried weight. It wasn't an emotional reaction, but a professional one, rooted in decades of familiarity with the site. Archaeologists rely on pattern recognition, and this shape refused to conform to any established pattern from the Ness, or even from Neolithic Orkney more broadly. Its proportions were too regular, its orientation was too controlled. It looked less like something that had evolved over time, and more like something imposed with intention. Equally striking was where it appeared. The feature sat outside the dense core of known buildings, occupying space that had long been assumed to be marginal or empty. Earlier surveys had hinted at activity in these areas, but nothing had prepared the team for a structure so clearly bounded. It suggested planning on a scale that extended beyond the monumental core, hinting at a different understanding of how the site functioned as a whole. What followed was a deliberate pause. The team resisted the urge to explain too quickly. Public speculation was avoided, not because the discovery lacked importance, but because it demanded discipline. In archaeology, certainty grows slowly. The anomaly was real, but understanding it required knowing how such clarity had been achieved in the first place. How GPR turned the Ness into a time map. Ground-penetrating radar does not simply reveal what lies underground, it reveals relationships. Instead of peeling back the earth layer by layer with a trowel, GPR sends pulses into the ground and records how they bounce back, capturing subtle differences in material, density, and depth. At the Ness of Brodgar, this process was taken to an unprecedented level of detail. The site was scanned in horizontal slices, each one just 6 centimeters apart. Individually, those slices looked abstract, almost meaningless, but when stacked together digitally, they formed a three-dimensional volume that archaeologists could move through at will. It was like scrolling through time, watching features emerge, shift, and fade as depth increased. For the first time, the Ness could be explored not just across space, but through its full vertical complexity. This mattered because earlier geophysical methods had limits. Magnetometry and resistivity surveys had been invaluable in identifying structures, but they flattened the past. They showed outlines, not sequences. GPR added that missing dimension. It allowed archaeologists to see whether walls belonged to the same phase, whether one structure cut through another, or whether gaps represented open ground or simply later disturbance. The scale of the operation was remarkable. High-resolution equipment was pulled across the entire site, generating enormous volumes of data in a matter of days. Processing it required specialized software and months of careful interpretation, but the payoff was clarity. Patterns that had once been guessed at could now be observed directly. Within this layered model, the anomalous shape took on new meaning. It did not just appear different on the surface, it persisted across depth slices in a way that suggested intentional construction during a distinct phase. It belonged to a layer that did not comfortably align with the main Neolithic horizon. And that was the moment the question stopped being what this structure was, and became when it had been created. The timeline problem that baffled experts. For 2 decades, the Ness of Brodgar had been understood as a site with a strong and consistent Neolithic identity. Its architecture followed recognizable patterns, its art shared a common visual language, and its material culture fit comfortably within a defined time frame. That consistency was one of its strengths, as it allowed archaeologists to interpret the site as a unified complex rather than a patchwork of unrelated activity. But the newly identified feature unsettled that clarity, and it could rewrite history. Its rectilinear precision did not align with the architectural signature established through excavation. In prehistoric Britain, straight-edge geometry often points toward later periods, when construction traditions and social organization had shifted. That raised a difficult possibility. What if the Ness was not exclusively Neolithic? What if it had been revisited, reused, or reinterpreted long after its supposed closure? Such a scenario would challenge long-held assumptions about abandonment. The prevailing narrative suggested that activity at the Ness ended around 2400 BC, coinciding with broader cultural changes. Evidence of later phases, perhaps from the Bronze Age or even the Iron Age, would complicate that picture, suggesting continuity rather than collapse. It would also force archaeologists to reconsider how sacred landscapes evolve rather than disappear. Yet timelines cannot be rewritten based on shapes alone. No matter how suggestive the GPR data may be, dating requires physical evidence. Organic material must be sampled, contexts must be established, and stratigraphy must be confirmed. That can only happen through excavation, however limited. Answering the question of when this feature belongs would require reopening the ground, but only just enough to let the past speak for itself. Precision archaeology: why the dig will remain historic. When archaeologists talk about returning to the Ness of Brodgar, they are careful with the language they use. This is not a complete reopening. It is not a new phase of large-scale excavation. What is being planned is something far more controlled, and in many ways, more ambitious. In 2026, the team intends to cut a small number of highly targeted trenches, placed exactly where the radar data demands. This approach reflects how archaeology has evolved with modern technology. In the past, trenches were exploratory. They were designed to find out what might be there. At the Ness, that uncertainty has largely been removed. The ground-penetrating radar has already mapped the subsurface in extraordinary detail. The purpose of the excavation now is verification. Archaeologists call this process ground truthing, and it is about confirming depth, structure, and most importantly, chronology. The trenches will be narrow, almost surgical in their precision. Their goal is to intersect key points of the anomalous feature, just enough to recover material suitable for dating. Even a small sample of charcoal, bone, or organic residue could anchor the entire structure in time. That single result would carry more interpretive weight than years of broader digging ever could. Public attention has intensified with the involvement of Time Team, which brings both funding and visibility. Filming adds pressure, but Nick Card has been clear that spectacle will not drive the process. Decisions remain grounded in conservation ethics and scientific discipline. The Ness has survived for thousands of years. Rushing its final chapters would serve no one. What makes this moment historic is not what will be uncovered, but how. Archaeologists are acting with confidence, born of data rather than intuition. They are testing a hypothesis formed through technology, not chance. It is a model that values restraint over exposure and understanding over accumulation. If successful, it will demonstrate that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the smallest cuts in the ground. When this discovery rewrote the entire Orkney landscape, the implications of the anomaly beneath the Ness of Brodgar extend far beyond the boundaries of the site itself. The Ness sits at the center of one of Europe's most carefully studied prehistoric landscapes, framed by monuments that have long been understood as part of a single Neolithic vision. The Ring of Brodgar, the stones of Ness, and Maeshowe have been interpreted as expressions of a shared cultural moment, rising and fading together. If evidence confirms later activity at the Ness, that neat alignment begins to unravel. The landscape would no longer represent a brief fluorescence followed by abandonment, but a place revisited and reinterpreted across generations. Sacred spaces may have endured, absorbing new meanings rather than being left behind. That possibility reshapes how archaeologists think about continuity, memory, and inheritance in prehistoric societies. Such a shift carries consequences for how other sites are understood. Across Britain and beyond, many places are considered finished simply because later layers were not expected or actively sought. The Ness suggests that the absence of evidence may sometimes reflect the limits of earlier methods rather than historical reality. Sites thought to belong firmly to one period might contain later chapters hidden just beyond the reach of traditional excavation. There is also a methodological impact. The Ness has become a proving ground for non-destructive archaeology at scale. By combining high-resolution geophysics with minimal excavation, researchers can ask bigger questions while preserving sites for the future. In an era of accelerating erosion and climate pressure, that balance is no longer optional. What began as a single geometric anomaly now points toward a broader rethinking of prehistoric landscapes. If a site as intensively studied as the Ness can still surprise, it raises an unsettling but productive thought. Beneath Scotland, and beneath many other places thought to be understood, the past may be far less settled than anyone assumed. Key takeaways from what was found beneath Scotland. What archaeologists found beneath Scotland was not a hidden treasure or a lost monument waiting to be uncovered. It was something far more disruptive. They found evidence that the Ness of Brodgar, long understood as a complete Neolithic complex, may not have been the end of the story at all. Using ground-penetrating radar, researchers revealed a sharply defined structure that does not match the architectural language of the site as it was previously known. Its form, depth, and persistence across layers suggest a different phase of activity, one that may belong to a later period than previously believed. This discovery did not come from digging deeper, but from seeing differently. Across more than 2 decades, Nick Card has helped shape every major interpretation of the Ness. From its first tentative trenches to this moment of reconsideration, the anomaly does not overturn that work, it builds on it, showing how even the most carefully studied sites can still hold surprises when new tools are applied. What remains now is confirmation, not speculation. A small trench will soon test the radar's story, and with it, the timeline of one of Britain's most important prehistoric places. Until then, the ground remains closed, but the questions are wide open. If the Ness of Brodgar wasn't the end of a story, how many other pasts are still buried in plain sight? Tell us what you think in the comments, and for more such fascinating history, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.